A sudden ringing shattered his thoughts. The doorbell. It was absurd to think anyone would be outside in this weather. Hesitant yet curious, Terence grabbed the closest object resembling a weapon, a heavy metal wrench, and approached the door. The ringing grew more frantic. He flung open the door to find a woman slumped on the porch, her long hair plastered to her face, her body shivering and weak. Without a second thought, he pulled her inside, shutting the door against the deafening storm. The woman gasped for air, clutching her sides, as if in pain. Her clothes were tattered, soaked through, and smeared with mud. I've only been here for a day, she stammered between ragged breaths. Her eyes, wide with terror, darted around the room. What is this? What's happening to your planet? Terence stared at her, confusion and suspicion warring within him. He took a step back, his mind racing as he noticed the unnatural pallor of her skin, the strange luminescence in her eyes that seemed to pulse faintly, like a hidden star. Then it clicked. This woman wasn't from Earth. His jaw tightened. Aliens, again. As one of the world's leading astrophysicists, Terence had long been a target of extraterrestrial interest. They sent agents, planted surveillance devices, and monitored his every move. He had grown used to it, though never comfortable with it. And now, another one had shown up at his doorstep, this time during a life-threatening storm. I think you need to calm down, he said, his voice measured, concealing the mix of irritation and concern bubbling inside him. The woman's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto his. Calm down, there's a whirlwind of death outside, and I don't even know if I'll survive the next hour. Terence frowned. You're lucky to have survived this long. Who are you? Why are you here? The woman hesitated, her expression flickering between fear and defiance. My name is Nara, she said finally. I was sent here to observe you. To observe humans. That's all I know. Terence scoffed, running a hand over his face. Of course, another spy, another agent dispatched to poke around in his life. But something about her seemed different. Most agents he'd encountered were cold, calculated, almost robotic in their demeanor. Nara, on the other hand, looked lost, almost human in her vulnerability. Sent here, huh? He folded his arms, studying her. So, you're admitting it? That you're one of them? That you're here to spy on me? Nara looked away, her voice trembling. I don't care anymore. I almost died out there. None of this matters right now. Her raw honesty caught him off guard. Terence found himself softening against his better judgment. He could tell she wasn't lying, or, at least, she wasn't telling the whole truth. The tornado outside continued to rage, rattling the windows as though the storm itself were trying to force its way in. Nara hugged her arms around herself, shivering. Her clothes were in tatters, offering little protection from the cold. Wait here, Terence said gruffly, disappearing into another room. He returned with a stack of clothing. These belonged to someone I used to know. Nara nodded silently, taking the clothes. She disappeared into the bathroom to change. Minutes later, she emerged, her expression pale and tense. Terence, she called, her voice shaking. There's something wrong. He turned to see her lifting her shirt just enough to reveal a small metallic object embedded in her abdomen. A tiny light blinked steadily, its rhythm almost hypnotic. Terence froze, his scientific mind instantly shifting into gear. Lie down, he instructed, already grabbing a magnifying glass from a nearby desk. As he examined the device, his heart sank. The technology was far beyond anything Earth had developed. He leaned back, his mind racing. It's a tracker, isn't it? They're monitoring you. Nara's hands flew to her head, panic etched across her face. Now I remember, she said, her voice breaking. Before we're sent here, they implant these devices in us. They told us we couldn't form any attachments to humans. If we did, the punishment. She trailed off, tears welling in her eyes. If I disobey, they'll kill me. Terence felt a pang of sympathy. He hated himself for it, but he couldn't help it. Despite everything, she didn't seem like an enemy. She seemed trapped. We need to remove it, he said firmly. Her eyes widened in alarm. You can't. If they detect that the device is gone. They won't, he interrupted. Not if we're smart about it. He led her down to the basement, where his personal laboratory lay hidden beneath the house. Nara stared in shock at the sheer scale of it. Shelves filled with strange equipment, monitors flashing incomprehensible data, and a workbench cluttered with vials and tools. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "My sanctuary," he said. "Now, hold still." He worked quickly, mixing a concoction of chemicals that would hopefully dissolve the device without harming her. "This is going to hurt," he warned, pouring the mixture onto the implant. Nara cried out in pain as the liquid hissed and bubbled against her skin. Moments later, the device disintegrated, leaving nothing but a faint scar. She sat up, breathing heavily, her eyes burning with both relief and fury. "What did you do to me?" "I freed you," Terrence said, "but this isn't over. If they realize the device is gone, they'll come for me," she finished, her voice trembling. "And for me," he added grimly. Silence hung between them for a long moment. Finally, Nara spoke, her voice softer now. "Why did you help me? You didn't have to." Terrence hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe it's because I've spent my life being watched, used, and manipulated. I couldn't stand to see someone else go through the same thing. Or maybe," he trailed off, his eyes meeting hers, "maybe I see something in you. Something worth protecting." Her breath hitched, her chest tightening with an unfamiliar warmth. "You shouldn't trust me," she said, though her voice wavered. "And yet, here we are," he replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. Before either of them could say more, a loud crash echoed from outside. The storm had subsided, but a heavy silence had settled in its place. Terrence's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy wrench he had set down earlier. Nara flinched at the sound, her gaze darting toward the window. "What was that?" she whispered. Terrence moved toward the small basement window, careful not to expose himself. Peering out, he caught sight of a dark, sleek object lodged in the middle of his backyard. It was about the size of a small car, its smooth, metallic surface reflecting the dim light of the stormy sky. "That's not debris," he muttered, his jaw tightening. Nara pushed herself to her feet, still visibly shaken. "It's a scout pod," she said quietly. "They're here." Terrence glanced back at her, his mind racing. "How many? If it's just a pod, probably 2 or 3 operatives," she replied. "They send those ahead to locate targets before the main force arrives." Terrence swore under his breath. He had faced enough threats in his life to know that when it came to extraterrestrial operatives, even 2 or 3 could be overwhelming. His lab was stocked with advanced equipment and experimental tech, but it wasn't a fortress. Nara looked at him, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "We don't have much time. They'll scan the area, and when they realize the tracker is gone, they'll come straight for us," he finished. He crossed the room, opening a large cabinet and pulling out a strange, rifle-like device. It was cobbled together from various components, its purpose immediately unclear. Nara frowned. "What is that?" "Something I've been working on," Terrence said, checking the weapon settings. "A focused EMP launcher. It's experimental, but if it works, it should disable their suits, and maybe their tech. If it works?" Nara raised an eyebrow. Terrence smirked, despite the tension. "Guess we'll find out." Suddenly, a bright beam of light pierced through the window, sweeping across the room like a searchlight. Nara ducked instinctively, pulling Terrence down with her. "They've already started scanning," she whispered, her voice urgent. "We need to move." Terrence nodded and led her toward the far corner of the lab, where a reinforced hatch lay embedded in the floor. He punched a code into a nearby panel, and the hatch slid open, revealing a narrow tunnel. "Escape tunnel," he explained. "It leads to an old storm shelter about a mile from here." Nara hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "If we leave, they'll just follow us. And if they find your lab, they'll destroy it," Terrence said grimly. "But staying here isn't an option. We'll figure out a plan once we're safe." Before they could climb down, another crash echoed from above. This time, it was closer, inside the house. The faint hum of alien technology filled the air, a sound Terrence recognized all too well. "They're in," Nara said, her voice barely audible. Terrence grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the tunnel. "Go. Now?" Nara hesitated for only a second before sliding into the tunnel. Terrence followed, sealing the hatch behind them, just as footsteps echoed down the basement stairs. The tunnel was dark and narrow, the air damp and cold. They crawled through in silence, the only sound their labored breathing. Terrence's mind raced. If the operatives found his lab, they would know exactly who they were dealing with, and they wouldn't stop until both he and Nara were captured or dead. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into the storm shelter. It was a small, concrete space, sparsely furnished with a cot, a table, and a few supplies. Terrence flicked on a battery-powered lantern, casting a dim glow over the room. Nara leaned against the wall, her face pale. "We can't keep running," she said. "They'll find us no matter where we go." Terrence set the EMP device on the table, his mind working furiously. "Then we make a stand." Nara stared at him. "Against the scout team? Terrence, they'll be armed with tech that makes your EMP look like a toy." "Maybe," he admitted, "but I've got more than just this." He opened a small locker in the corner, revealing an assortment of gadgets and weapons. Nara's eyes widened as she took in the collection. "You've been preparing for this," she said. Terrence nodded. "Ever since the first time they came for me." He handed her a small device resembling a wristband. "Here, it's a portable shield generator. It won't last long, but it might buy you a few seconds if things go south." She took it, strapping it to her wrist. "What about you?" Terrence picked up a second device, a compact, handheld emitter. "I'll manage." The faint hum of alien technology grew louder, echoing through the tunnel behind them. Nara's eyes widened. "They're coming." Terrence nodded, gripping his EMP launcher tightly. "Then let's show them what humans are made of." The first operative emerged from the tunnel, its sleek, armored form illuminated by the lantern's glow. Its helmeted head turned toward them, and a cold, mechanical voice echoed through the room. "Subject, Terrence Cortland. Subject, Nara. Surrender immediately." Terrence fired the EMP without hesitation. A burst of energy erupted from the device, striking the operative square in the chest. Its armor sparked and hissed, and the alien stumbled back, its systems temporarily disabled. Before they could celebrate, a second operative appeared, raising a weapon that crackled with energy. Nara activated her shield just in time, the alien's blast deflecting harmlessly off the glowing barrier. Terrence fired again, but the second operative dodged, moving with inhuman speed. It lunged at him, and he barely managed to roll out of the way. "Nara!" he shouted. She didn't hesitate. Grabbing a makeshift weapon from a locker, she swung it with all her strength, striking the operative's exposed joint. It faltered, giving Terrence the opening he needed. He fired a second EMP shot, and the alien collapsed, its systems fried. Breathing heavily, Nara turned to Terrence. "Is that all of them?" Before he could answer, a loud, piercing noise filled the air. The pod outside had activated, its beacon summoning reinforcements. Terrence's face hardened. "They've called for backup." Nara met his gaze, determination shining in her eyes. "Then we end this. No more running." Terrence nodded, a grim smile forming. "Let's make them regret coming here." Together, they began preparing the shelter for the battle to come.